Let's talk about a few functions for converting strings to numbers and vice versa. Now, you might be wondering, why do we ever need to convert a string to a number? Well, in some environments, like applications with a graphical user interface, we often receive the input as a string. So the value that the user enters into a text box, we get that value as a string. Now, to perform any kind of mathematical operation on that value, first we have to convert that value from a string to a number. Here's an example. Imagine we read the price of a product as a string. Now, as you might know, we cannot perform any mathematical operations on this variable. So this is where we need to convert the string to a number. Now we have a bunch of functions. They all start with s, that is short for string. Then we have to, and a letter that identifies the target type. So here we have d, that is short for double. We also have f for float, I for integer, and so on. Now, all these functions work the same way, so I'm only going to show you one of them, this one. So we can call this and pass a string. We don't really need this variable. And this returns a double that we can store in this variable. Now let's print this and make sure it works. Good. Now, what if the value that we receive is not a valid number? So let's put an x at the end. Take a look. We still get the right value. Now, what if we put the x right after the decimal point? Look what happens. The fraction part is gone. So this function does its best to convert the string to a number, but it's not always successful. For example, if we put the x at the beginning, look, our program crashed with an exception. An exception is a way to report errors in our programs. We'll talk about them in the next part of the course. So this is something you need to keep in mind when working with these functions. If the input doesn't represent a valid number, we have to properly handle these exceptions and show an error to the user instead of letting our program crash. Again, we'll talk about that in the next part of the course. Now, sometimes we need to go the opposite direction. So we might have a number and then we need to convert it to a string. For that, we have a different function called toString. Now, as you can see, this function is overloaded. So we have an overload that takes an integer. We have another one that takes a long, a float, and so on. So we can call this function and give it a number like 19. And this returns a string. Now we can print this and we get a string on a terminal. Now, what if we pass a floating point number like this? Look what happens. We get all these trailing zeros. Now, if you want to have more control over how these numbers are converted to a string, then you have to use streams. We'll talk about streams later in the course.